Before we begin the story, leave a comment below with where in the world you're watching from today and whether you enjoy it. A teenage boy was sitting quietly in his first-class seat, ticket in hand, saying nothing to anyone. The flight attendant didn't care, so she looked at his clothes, rolled her eyes, and accused him of stealing the seat. Within seconds, she slapped him in front of everyone. She didn't realize the man sitting 3 rows behind her wasn't just another passenger, he was the boy's father and the owner of the entire airline. It was his first time flying without his parents, and although he appeared calm on the outside, he was anxious. He was only 16 years old, sitting quietly near the boarding gate with his caretaker, Brenda, a kind and soft-spoken woman who had been with his family since he was a toddler. He was wearing simple clothes, a navy hoodie, sneakers, and jeans, and kept his head down, scrolling through his phone until the boarding call came. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. Always traveled in private jets with his family or with his father by his side, but this time he was traveling in first class with just Brenda, and he wanted everything to go as planned. His father had made sure that everything was in order, including putting a handwritten note in his bag telling him to be brave and enjoy the flight. When boarding began, Brenda took his bag gently while he showed the attendant his ticket. The woman at the gate grinned and scanned their passes, nodded them through, and soon they were entering the cool, opulent first-class cabin with wide seats, soft lighting, and soothing music. It felt like a different world. The boy, named Elliot, sat by the window while Brenda put their bags in the overhead bin. He put on his seatbelt and took out his headphones, eager to unwind and watch a movie, but then a flight attendant named Cheryl, who had red lipstick, sharp cheekbones, and a tight expression, stopped next to there. She didn't greet them or smile like she had done with the other passengers. Instead, her eyes went straight to Elliot, narrowing slightly as she looked him up and down. She then raised an eyebrow at Brenda and asked, "Is this your seat?" Brenda nodded and held out the tickets once more, saying, "Yes, ma'am, we're in 1A and 1B. This section is for first-class passengers," Cheryl said, barely looking at the tickets before folding her arms. "Yes, we know this is first class, these are our seats," she said, blinking. Elliot said nothing, but he could already feel the tension growing. People nearby had turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen, but clearly listening to every word. "If these were printed incorrectly, we'll sort it out, but you can't stay here," said Cheryl. "But this is my seat," he said softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Cheryl waved her hand in annoyance, saying, "That's not necessary, you can take your things and move to the back, I don't have time for this." Her tone became more abrasive and disrespectful. Elliot looked up, bewildered and embarrassed. "But this is my seat," she said. "Are you talking back to me?" Cheryl's eyes narrowed even more, and before anyone could respond, she slapped him. Her hand moved quickly, striking his cheek with a loud snap that reverberated throughout the cabin, stopping everything. A businessman lowered his coffee, a woman covered her mouth, and Brenda stood frozen, one hand still holding her phone. Elliot sat completely still, stunned, his cheek turning red, and his eyes blinking slowly as he tried to comprehend what had happened. He didn't cry or yell, he just stared at Cheryl, stunned and silent. Cheryl glared at him, saying, "Don't raise your voice again, not on this plane." The cabin was silent, and no one moved. Cheryl turned and left as if nothing had happened. Elliot slowly reached into his pocket, unlocked his phone, and typed a brief message, "She hit me first class," and then he hit send. Brenda was still frozen, her eyes wide with shock, and she looked at Elliot before walking down the aisle where Cheryl had vanished. Her hands trembled as she took out a napkin and gently pressed it to Elliot's cheek, asking, "Are you okay?" She said, "Baby?" Elliot nodded a little, but he didn't say anything. His fingers were curled around his phone, and his thumb was hovering over the screen. "Now, I need to speak to the captain," she said, and a few other passengers started to murmur, some of them obviously disturbed by what they had just witnessed. One man leaned over to his wife and whispered, "Did she really just hit him?" The wife nodded slightly, her eyes still fixed on Elliot, but no one got up or raised their voice, they all just watched as his phone clicked. "What do you mean she hit you? Where are you?" was his father's response, down at the screen. Elliot typed back quickly, his hands trembling a little. "Still in seat 1A, she said. I didn't belong here." Brenda attempted to explain that she had slapped me in front of everyone, and a second buzz followed, saying, "Sit tight, do not move, I'm on this flight." He blinked and read the message once more. His father was on the flight. He looked up and scanned the cabin. Brenda sat down next to him again, her jaw clenched. "I'm going to report her the second we land," she muttered. "This isn't going to be forgotten." Elliot hardly heard her. He turned to face the back of the cabin, where a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit had just gotten up from one of the last rows in first class. His face was composed, but his eyes were burning with something steady and cold. When she saw him, Elliot sat up straighter. Cheryl, who was halfway down the aisle serving drinks to another passenger, turned and froze when she saw him coming. Her fake smile vanished instantly. Preston stopped next to her. His voice was calm but had a sharp edge. "You slapped my son." Cheryl's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She blinked visibly as she tried to process what she had heard. "When you put your hand on him," passengers leaned in slightly, sensing something serious was happening. Cheryl's face flushed red. "I thought he shouldn't have been in that seat. I thought he was trying to sneak in." Preston took one step closer. "And you thought that was the problem?" His voice was still quiet, but now it carried weight. "Did you check his ticket?" "I asked to see it, but it didn't seem right." "Did you call anyone?" "It seemed wrong." Preston's voice never rose, but Cheryl flinched as if he had yelled, "You didn't think he belonged in first class, so you made a decision that will now cost you everything. To confirm that I didn't think I needed to, you chose to put your hands on him in front of a full cabin." Cheryl looked around, realizing that everyone was watching her. Whispers were moving through the rows, and phones were recording her confidence. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." The junior attendants quickly put the captain on the phone and informed him that Preston Carter needed to talk to him. Cheryl stood motionless, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The authority she had held only moments before had disappeared, and Elliot sat quietly in his seat, watching his father take control of the sky. The cabin was so quiet now that even the sound of the engine seemed far away. Cheryl stood rigidly next to the drink cart, her hands clenched at her sides, trying to keep her breathing steady. Preston didn't look at her. "This is Preston Carter. I assume you've been informed." After a brief pause, he put the receiver to his ear and said, "I want her removed from all cabin duties immediately. She is not to speak to any passengers. When we land, I want ground security waiting at the gate." He stood close to Elliot's seat again, his back straight, eyes focused forward. The junior flight attendant returned quickly, holding a small phone unit from the crew intercom. Preston handed the phone back to the junior attendant and turned slowly toward Cheryl, his voice calm, but no one spoke, not even the passengers who had previously ignored the situation, who were now wide-eyed and pretending to browse through phones while paying close attention. The captain's voice came through the speaker loud enough that Preston didn't even need to repeat the words understood. "Sir, she will be relieved of duty at once." Cheryl opened her mouth to say, "You're done for this flight," but the words stuck in her throat. She lowered her head and pushed the drink cart toward the back, each step feeling heavier than the last. The silence was her punishment. Brenda shook her head and looked at Elliot, asking, "Are you all right?" He nodded, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know he was on the flight." She smiled softly, realizing that he prefers to keep people honest by not announcing himself, so he sat down next to her. Elliot looked at his son, and his eyes softened. His voice was small, and he said, "I didn't know what to do." "You didn't have to do anything. You did exactly what I've taught you. Stay calm, tell the truth. Let the right people handle the wrong ones." A nearby passenger, a man in a gray sweater, leaned across the aisle. "Sir, I saw what happened, and I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not saying something sooner." He looked at him once, nodded, and said, "Thank you, but you should have said it." The man looked down in shame at the flight attendant, Cheryl, who was now sitting in the back row with his eyes fixed on her lap. She appeared to have lost everything she believed she had control over, and behind her, 2 other crew members were whispering in low voices, obviously aware of what had happened. Preston adjusted his seat, and Brenda quietly gave Elliot a bottle of water. After that, nobody said much because the atmosphere had changed, the energy in the cabin had completely changed, and the crew no longer lived in their uniform. The plane glided smoothly above the clouds, but the tension in the cabin persisted. Occasionally, passengers would glance toward the front, their eyes darting from Elliot to Preston and then quickly away as if ashamed. It now sat quietly next to a boy with a swollen cheek and a calm expression. Elliot reached into his backpack and took out the letter his father had written him before the flight. He unfolded it and read the last line again, this time with a new meaning: "You are stronger than they think." Back in the crew galley, Cheryl sat with her arms folded, her gaze fixed on the floor, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, her thoughts racing. She had handled hundreds of flights, turned away people, questioned travelers she didn't trust, and never once had she been challenged until today. To be caught staring, Brenda had pulled a blanket over Elliot's legs and whispered softly to him occasionally while Preston sat calmly and unreadable next to them. A younger flight attendant named Grace was leaning against the counter, quietly glancing at her as she watched the entire event unfold. Although she had remained silent during the incident, her silence had begun to feel like guilt. After a lengthy pause, she finally said, "You really didn't check his name." She had already made up her mind after looking at him, his clothes, and his face. "You didn't question the man in 3C who entered wearing cargo shorts and sandals, but you did question a boy who showed you his ticket, and I thought he was lying." Cheryl snapped, her voice slow and shaky, "And I didn't think he belonged in that seat." Grace nodded slowly, her face thoughtful, and she didn't respond. Her throat tightened, and she looked more intently at the floor. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain ended a quiet call with ground control and turned to Elliot. Leaned his head against the window, still silent, and Preston looked at him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm wondering if she would have hit me if I looked different." "Maybe not," he said gently. "What matters now is that she won't do it again. His co-pilot security has already been informed. Mr. Carter made it clear that she's not walking off this plane like nothing happened. We're not just going to hold her accountable, we're going to make sure the entire system learns from this." "How do you know?" Preston didn't respond with words. He just reached for the cabin phone once more and called the flight manager on the ground. "This is Preston Carter. I need the full video from today's flight pulled immediately. Cabin security footage, passenger statements, I want everything reviewed before we land." The voice on the other end confirmed it. Preston hung up and looked at his son steadily. Elliot nodded slightly. At the back of the plane, Cheryl gradually started to realize that this wasn't going away. The minutes passed, but Cheryl felt trapped in time, with her hands resting rigidly on her lap and her mouth dry. She stopped pretending to be busy, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw one of the other attendants whispering something into the cabin phone that she didn't have to. He didn't feel powerful yet, but something had changed the silence that had felt heavy to something else, like respect. As she walked down the aisle earlier, she noticed that people were looking at her and judging her. The worst part was that they had all seen what she had done before and knew who the boy was, so she couldn't hide from it. Now, at the front of the plane, Preston sat calmly, but his mind was racing. He had built his airline from nothing, and people frequently saw the suits, private offices, and media headlines, but they didn't see the long nights. This moment wasn't just personal, it was systemic, involving cold boardrooms and the struggle to be taken seriously in a world that didn't expect someone like him to be in charge. In seat 4A, he was prepared to stand up and looked at Elliot, who had fallen into a quiet stillness, not sleeping but resting, his cheeks still faintly red. Beverly reached into her bag and handed Preston a small envelope, saying softly, "You told me to carry this just in case," adding, "Figured now might be the time." Opened the flap and slid out a folded letter containing official airline documents. Inside were 2 cards. One was Elliot's first-class membership card, which was signed privately and only senior crew members knew it. The other was a platinum ID badge given to airline family members. His son had been cleared both personally and officially, but Cheryl had still decided he didn't belong. Preston tucked the envelope into his jacket, looked over his shoulder, and noticed that the passengers were now quiet but attentive. He then slowly stood up and approached. He didn't raise his voice but instead said, "I'd like to speak with the rest of the crew. Please move away from the passengers one by one." The attendants followed him into the small galley, where Cheryl stayed seated until one of them gave her a gentle tap on the shoulder. She didn't want to move, but she knew that refusing would only make things worse. Once the crew was assembled, Preston spoke clearly. "You've all been trained to treat passengers with dignity, not just the—" "I'm not here to scare you," Preston continued, "but understand that when you work for my airline, you answer for the way you treat every soul on that plane. That boy you dismiss, that boy is mine, but even if he wasn't, he deserved better than what happened." No one spoke. "Those you think are important, not just those who match what you expect today. That training failed and you stood by and let it happen." Some of the crew shifted uncomfortably, he added. "This won't stay in the air." He looked Cheryl in the eye just once before turning back down the aisle. She didn't try to follow. She didn't have the strength, not anymore. Preston returned to his seat without another word. The moment he sat down, he looked at Elliot, who now sat upright, alert again. There was a trace of something different in the boy's eyes, not fear, not confusion, something steadier. Preston nodded at him as if to say, "I saw it too. That crew doesn't know who they're dealing with. They've never seen you like this." Brenda leaned in and whispered, "They're not supposed to see me like this. That's the point, but now they will." A man in a business suit discreetly cleared his throat behind them. "I just wanted to say I saw the whole thing, sir. I'm sorry I didn't step in." Preston didn't turn around. His reply was calm but firm. "If you hadn't known who we were, would you still feel sorry?" Brenda said. The younger attendant tried to say something but hesitated because she didn't want to add to the tension, but the air was heavy with it. Eventually, Cheryl spoke, barely raising her voice above a whisper. "I made a mistake." "I get that." Grace looked at her. "This wasn't just a mistake. This was something you didn't even stop to question. You just saw him and decided. You didn't ask. You didn't confirm. You." Galley Cheryl stood with her back against the wall, her heart pounding, her hands cold, and she could feel the weight of stares from her own co-workers. Grace. Cheryl sank into one of the jump seats and stared at her shoes, feeling the pressure building in her chest, but she couldn't cry yet. She had spent years thinking she knew how things worked, believing she was doing the right thing, following rules, and maintaining order, but this wasn't about order. This was about pride. This was about judgment, and now she was the one. "I didn't care. I thought he was trying to sneak in, and you thought he didn't belong." That silence again. As the captain was being judged in the cockpit, he received another message from ground operations. He carefully read the screen and then nodded to the co-pilot security detail, who confirmed that Mr. Carter's instructions had been approved. The escort would be waiting at Gate 4 as soon as we arrived. The co-pilot looked toward the door, thinking she knew what was going to happen. The captain sighed, knowing that he would soon find out. Meanwhile, Elliot opened the note his father had written him again, but the corner of the paper was bent from the repeated touches. He folded the paper and put it back in his bag. Across the aisle, a woman leaned in slightly and murmured in a soft voice, "You were very brave." He repeated the words, "You don't need to shout to be heard. Strength doesn't always speak loudly, sometimes it just sits silently and waits." Most people would have screamed. You didn't. That's real power. Elliot turned to her in surprise and said, "Thank you." The woman smiled kindly, and Brenda looked at her and nodded, grateful that someone had finally said something. However, Elliot didn't smile because he wasn't proud yet, because, in reality, he didn't want to be brave today. All he wanted was to fly, watch a movie, land safely, and go home. However, someone decided he didn't look like he belonged in seat 1A, and now everything had changed. It was the first thing she had written down that didn't feel like an excuse. The hum of the engines continued overhead, smooth and steady, but inside the cabin the air felt tight and heavy with everything that had been left unsaid for too long. She took out her little cruise notepad, her fingers shaking slightly as she opened to a blank page and wrote, "Today I let pride speak louder than reason." She stared at the words for a long time, not sure if she was writing it for herself or for someone else. wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what it revealed. Elliot sat with his head leaned against the seat, his eyes focused on nothing in particular, and Preston watched him out of the corner of his eye. Something in Elliot's posture caught his attention, something he knew all too well, not sadness or anger, but the sharpness of his posture. No one dared to make jokes or small talk any longer, and even the flight attendants moving through the aisles spoke only when necessary, their voices lowered, steady but stiff. Preston put a firm hand on Elliot's shoulder and said, "Tell me what you're feeling." Elliot hesitated for a moment, but then slowly turned to face his father. She didn't even ask my name. Instead, she looked at me and made up her mind. Preston nodded once, his jaw clenched. "You're right, I didn't even speak loud," Elliot added. "I was just sitting here, and she didn't even talk to the man across from us," he said, looking as if he had just woken up in a laundromat that pulled. Brenda took a deep breath, trying not to laugh, but her expression remained serious as she reached for Elliot's hand and held it tenderly. "She picked me," Elliot said, his voice lowering. Out of everyone, Preston let the silence sit for a moment, then he leaned in and said, "And now everyone's watching her because you didn't scream, weren't fight, didn't give her what she expected, you gave her truth, and now she has to live with it." Elliot looked down, unsure of how to react. It was consoling, yes, but it didn't take away the pain in his cheek or the sting of the first time someone said, "You don't belong here in the rear galley." Cheryl was still holding the notepad, and the words she had written stared back at her. For the first time in years, she had no answers, so her fingers moved slowly as she wrote again. "He was courteous and composed, but I still decided to embarrass him." She stared at the sentence for so long that her vision started to. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Grace standing there with her arms crossed, but her face softened. "Now you know what's going to happen when we land, right?" Grace said quietly, and Cheryl didn't respond. "They've already contacted the gate. Security will be waiting," she said, looking at her and whispering, "Do you think I deserve it?" Grace hesitated, then she said, "It's not about what I think, it's about what you did." Cheryl blinked quickly in an attempt to regain her composure. The captain's voice came over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will start our descent in about 20 minutes. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." Passengers started moving around in their seats, adjusting their tray tables. Some pretended to settle in, while others silently watched, wondering what would happen next. "I didn't know who he was." Grace shook her head. "That's not the problem. You didn't think he was worthy of first class. That's what's going to stay with people back at the front of the plane. When we land," Preston leaned toward Brenda. "Elliot went straight to the private car because there would be reporters waiting. I don't want him to deal with cameras or questions." Brenda nodded. "What about you?" "I'm staying." Elliot turned to him and asked why. "I'm not leaving this flight until everyone who needs to answer does." He didn't answer, but the corners of his mouth turned slightly, half in gratitude and half in relief. Planned to do after the landing, but he knew that the woman who had slapped him was not going to leave the airport the way she had entered, confident and untouchable, pride no longer. Cheryl, who was sitting in the back, was thinking about what it meant to look at someone and determine who they are without asking, without listening, and without caring, and that thought hurt more than anything else. The descent had started, but for many people who had watched in silence during the earlier chaos were now sitting upright, pretending to read safety cards or peruse the in-flight magazine, but their eyes were constantly moving forward toward Elliot, toward Preston, and toward the thick silence that surrounded the front cabin. It felt like the flight had already landed somewhere they weren't prepared for, and the wheels hadn't touched the ground, but the truth had already arrived. "Your father's right," said Brenda, gently brushing Elliot's curls back from his forehead as she reached across the armrest. Across the aisle, a woman in a navy blazer slowly leaned over. Her voice was quiet but certain. "I saw everything," she said, "and I should have said something. I'm sorry. What happened today? You didn't deserve it, but you stood tall anyway." Elliot didn't respond. Instead, he continued to look straight ahead with his hands folded on his lap. He wasn't upset or crying, but something had hardened inside him. It had only taken one slap to change the way he would see people forever. Didn't move much, but he nodded slightly. "You're not alone," he said, and the woman's eyes fell to her lap. Preston wasn't the type of man who would blow up in public, but when his mind became quiet, he became eloquent, and at this moment, every moment of silence was forming what would happen once they arrived at the gate. He looked out the window, watching as clouds gave way to rooftop runways and city lights below, and he knew his assistant had complied with protocol. 2 executives from his corporate office would be waiting discreetly outside the jet bridge. One of them had already received Cheryl's name, and by this point, the legal team had reviewed the video. The next step would be swift in the rear galley, where Cheryl wiped her face with the edge of her sleeve. Her cheeks were blotchy, and she had stopped acting normally. Her name badge was still neatly clipped to her uniform, but it didn't carry the weight it used to. The landing gear was lowering beneath the floor, the cabin lights were dimming a little, and the captain's voice could be heard over the speaker as the crew prepared for landing one last time. Cheryl stood on unsteady legs and walked to the intercom, her fingers hovering over the button but not pressing it, so she didn't need to say anything more because everyone knew. She turned and sat back down, facing the rear bulkhead like a schoolchild waiting outside the principal's office, and Grace stood close to her with her arms crossed but without a smile. In first class, Preston dug into his coat pocket, took out his phone, opened the Notes app, and typed a single line, "Press no statements today, let the footage speak." Cheryl didn't respond. "You still have a chance to say something before this is over," she continued. "Not for them, for yourself." He sent it, and then Brenda leaned in closer to Elliot and said, "When that door opens, there might be a lot of flashing cameras, so just keep walking, don't stop. Don't speak, I don't want to be famous." Elliot muttered, "You're not," but Preston added, "You're visible, there's a difference, and now they're going to have to look at what they ignored." Though the seatbelt sign was still in place, Preston remained motionless, Brenda remained motionless, and Elliot sat quietly, his eyes now fixed on the exit ahead as if it were the finish line of something larger than a flight. The plane bounced gently as the wheels touched down before settling into a smooth glide down the runway. The woman in the navy blazer stood and spoke again, this time louder, addressing no one in particular. "You all witnessed it happen, and we all did a few." This time, Elliot didn't say anything, but when he looked around, he saw something different: guilt, reflection, shame, maybe even a little respect. The plane rolled to a gentle stop, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and outside the window, Elliot noticed 3 uniformed security officers standing. The passengers looked up, she turned slightly, and her voice became firmer. "A boy was slapped, and none of us got up." The man in the business suit nodded slowly, "and that will be in my thoughts for a long time." The cabin door clicked and the soft mechanical sound of the jet bridge locking into place signaled the end of the flight, but not the end of the story, as the usual announcements began to play over the speaker. No one moved, there was no excited rush for overhead luggage, no happy chatter, just a strange tense stillness as the passengers sat frozen waiting to see what would happen next. At the edge of the jet bridge, one was holding a clipboard, and another was scanning the crew manifest. Cheryl hadn't seen them yet, but she would. With his phone back in his pocket, his legs crossed, and one hand resting calmly on the armrest, he had no reason to hurry. Brenda leaned toward Elliot and whispered, "Don't look back, just focus forward when it's time to leave." Elliot nodded, his hands still clasped tightly together, his heart racing, but not out of fear, but something heavier. He wasn't worried about getting off the plane. Instead, he was thinking about what might happen to Cheryl and whether she would even comprehend why she was finally standing in the back. The intercom buzzed in the galley, and one of the junior attendants picked it up, listened quietly, and turned toward her. "They're asking for you," she said, causing Cheryl to freeze. The attendant nodded, and she swallowed hard, her throat dry, her palms clammy. She hadn't spoken since the landing, and the other crew members were avoiding eye contact. Her own team now felt like strangers. She left the galley and took a few shaky steps down the aisle as she passed through the first-class rows. As she passed, Elliot didn't turn his head, but he could smell the familiar floral scent of her perfume. For a moment, the memory of the slap burned hot in his mind once more, and he remained motionless. Cheryl arrived at the front of the plane and stood next to the open cabin door outside. Two airport security officers and a man in a dark blazer were waiting, one holding a clipboard, the other scanning the cabin. The same seats she had once ruled with confidence. "Miss Dawson, you are being escorted off this flight per direct instruction from executive oversight. You are to remain present for a formal review and incident report. Please cooperate fully," the man in the blazer said as he stepped forward, identifying himself as an airline operations manager. A murmur went through the cabin as Cheryl whispered, "Yes, sir." One of the officers entered, and Cheryl's eyes briefly glanced at Preston before she hurried off down the bridge. Her footsteps were heavy and quiet, and no one followed her. She entered the cabin by herself. An older man from row 2 stood up and carefully said, "I just want you to know, sir, I've flown with this airline for years, and I've never seen anything like this before." Preston looked up. The man nodded slowly and sat back down. The line to disembark started to form, but no one hurried to be first. There was an odd sense of respect in the air, and as the line moved, the woman in the navy blazer moved closer to Preston and Elliot. "I hope your son knows he did nothing wrong and that what happened was truly seen." Brenda smiled gently, knowing that Preston stood, adjusted his jacket, and held out his hand for Elliot the boy. When they reached the cabin door, Preston stopped and looked back, not at the passengers, but at the seat where Elliot had been sitting, seat 1A. He stared at it for a moment before turning around and entering the jet bridge with his son outside. Photographers and reporters began to flash as soon as they reached the aisle. A few passengers nodded at them, not out of sympathy but acknowledgement that they weren't just leaving a flight, but out of a moment that no one would forget. When they reached a waiting black car parked just beyond the doors, Elliot looked up at his father and asked, "Are they all here because of what happened?" Pre-son nodded. "They'll tell the story either way, we just made sure they get it right." As they got into the car, Elliot looked up the window and noticed Cheryl standing next to two airport officials near a service entrance. Her posture was stiff. The black car rolled away from the terminal, the windows tinted against the flurry of cameras and questions still echoing behind them. Inside, the silence felt different, not heavy like before, not filled with tension or hurt, but quiet with intention and understanding. Even from a distance, he could tell that she looked smaller now, not because of the cameras or the punishment, but because the truth had finally caught up. While Preston checked his phone messages, which were already piling up and mostly from executives, board members, and legal, he skimmed a few, locked the screen, and slipped the phone into his coat pocket. "No calls," he said firmly, to no one in particular, "not until we're home." Brenda sat on his other side, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Preston looked calm but serious as Elliot finally asked, "What's going to happen to her?" Elliot nodded slowly. "She looked so sure of herself when she told me to move, like she'd done it before. That depends on her, but she's not walking away like it didn't happen, and she's not going to decide who belongs in first class ever again." Back at the airport, Cheryl sat by herself in a chilly, windowless conference room close to the staff operations wing. The overhead lights buzzed softly, and the only sound was the ticking of a small clock on the wall. "She probably has," Brenda said quietly, maybe not with her hands but with her eyes, her tone, her assumptions. Preston looked out the front windshield, his voice steady. "That's the kind of power that people use quietly. It's not in rules or laws, it's in the belief that no one will stop you." The airline's regional HR manager was reading a printed incident report across from her. The footage had already been reviewed, passenger statements had been gathered, and nothing was left up for interpretation. Cheryl had slapped a teenage boy in front of witnesses, and after confirming that she had done so, she denied him her seat. Her hands were folded neatly on the chair next to her, knuckles white from the grip, and her heart was still racing, not because she was afraid of losing her job, but rather because she had finally realized how badly she had failed. His ticket, and she had completed everything because of his appearance, his attire, and her opinion that he shouldn't be Miss Dawson, the manager said, setting the papers down. "Before we proceed, is there anything you'd like to say?" Cheryl opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The manager gave her time, and after a long pause, her voice finally broke the silence. "I didn't think he belonged. I thought he was lying, and now," the manager asked, not coldly but directly. Cheryl looked up, her eyes red. The manager nodded once and noted that the Carter family has decided not to press criminal charges, but Mr. Carter has made it clear that a formal review will be sent to the board and you are suspended until that review is finished, she added. I treated him like a problem before I even spoke to him. Cheryl nodded, embarrassed but not surprised. The manager also slid a printed email across the table and asked us to show it to you. Cheryl hesitated before reading it, but it was brief. Just a message from Preston sent straight from his phone after the flight, saying, "She doesn't owe me an apology, she owes my son her respect." He didn't understand it yet, but he will. Cheryl lowered the paper slowly, her eyes stinging, the tears not yet falling, but they were there, silently building at the edge. She wasn't crying for her job, rather, she was crying because she saw herself clearly now, and she didn't. When they entered Preston's private residence, a large gated property far from the bustle of the airport, a black car pulled into the driveway. The housekeeper took their coats, and Brenda led Elliot to the stairs, but Elliot stopped halfway and turned back to his father. "Dad?" Preston asked. "I want to go to school like normal tomorrow, no drivers, no one walking me in, just normal." Preston raised an eyebrow, asking, "Are you sure?" Elliot nodded. "Yes, I don't want to be treated differently because of something that happened. I just want people to know that I belong without having to prove it." Preston took a deep breath, then he walked over and put a hand on his son's shoulder. "You never have to prove anything to anyone, but if you want normal, we'll give you normal," he said, smiling for the first time that day. As Elliot vanished upstairs, Preston turned toward the living room and at last let him. The next morning arrived with a clear silence and a pale sky outside Preston's house, but inside it was already in motion. Brenda stood in the kitchen quietly packing Elliot's belongings. He sat down and stared at the ceiling. It had been a long flight, and for the first time, it wasn't the turbulence in the air that made it difficult, but rather what happened when people forgot that power wasn't in the uniform or the seat assignment, but in how you treat the quiet kid sitting in 1A. While eating lunch, the television was on in the background, with the morning news anchors speaking in a low volume. The headline read, "Airline Flight Attendant Under Fire After First-Class Incident Involving CEO's Son." Preston was standing by the window, drinking coffee, and watching his son lace his sneakers close to the staircase. Elliot was wearing his typical outfit, which included a hoodie, backpack, and headphones around his neck. He looked like any other 16-year-old. "Your driver's waiting," Preston said gently as he got ready for school. "I told you I want to take the bus," Elliot answered without turning around. Preston didn't dispute. Instead, he nodded once, adding that the driver would follow at a distance just in case. Elliot sighed, but he didn't object once more. He got up, grabbed his bag, and turned to face his father. "If someone asks me about it today, what do I say?" Preston looked at him carefully. "You don't owe anyone your story, but if you decide to speak, tell the truth, nothing more." Elliot nodded, then he headed for the front door, but before he could leave, Brenda stopped him and placed a small folded note in his hoodie pocket. "Don't open that unless you need it," she said, winking. He grinned, then left the door softly closing behind him as the bus arrived at the stop at the corner. Preston's phone buzzed, a call from the boardroom, but he didn't answer. Instead, he opened his laptop and started going through the internal reports. Overnight, emails had poured in, half from department heads offering support and the other half from PR teams preparing statements. Preston wasn't ready to make any announcements just yet because he thought that statements only made sense after accountability. Cheryl sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, which she rarely used. The air was stale, the blinds were closed, her uniform hung over a chair, and the name badge that had once given her confidence was now a curse. Her phone buzzed with a news alert, but she chose not to open it. Instead, she opened the apology email she had written the previous evening, the screen glowing with the message she couldn't send. Subject: "To the boy I failed." She stared at the blinking cursor at the end of her final sentence, which she had rewritten a dozen times, but it always ended the same, "I didn't see you." Problem: she reached for the mouse to hit send, but stopped again. What if it was too late? What if it didn't matter? What if he didn't want to hear from her? Just as she was about to shut down the laptop, a new window appeared with a message from Grace. They're doing bias training now, and it's required starting next week. Though she didn't reply, she felt as though something had changed, something had begun, and perhaps she hadn't been erased entirely. We've reviewed the footage, collected passenger testimonies, and confirmed that the flight attendant's actions violated protocol at every level. Preston listened without expression as three executives sat across from him in a boardroom 15 stories above the city. One of them, a tall woman with glasses, started reading from a prepared statement. The flight attendant has been suspended indefinitely pending a final hearing, and the union is requesting a chance at reinstatement, but we're leaving that up to the decision. This isn't about her anymore, it's about the culture that made it seem normal. We're not just punishing someone, we're rebuilding a standard. One mistake on her part doesn't justify the silence around her. The room was quiet. Preston went on, "From now on, I want every single first-class crew member trained personally, not just on procedures but on perception. I want quarterly reviews, anonymous feedback from passengers, and a new reporting system for bias." Elliot got off the bus and headed toward the entrance, his hoodie pulled up to try to avoid attention. As he passed through the hallway, some kids whispered, others just stared, and one student stepped in front of him near his locker and said, "Hey, I saw what happened online, that was crazy." Elliot paused. "Yeah, I mean you." "The press strategy is permanent," one of the executives moved in his seat, "and it will require changes to our structure, staffing, and budget." "Didn't even do anything, and cheat." The boy shook his head just to say, "You didn't deserve that." Elliot didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, "Thank you." He opened his locker, took out the folded note Brenda had given him, looked around, and then opened it, remembering, "You're not here to be liked, you're here because you earned it. Keep your head up." He folded the note again, put it in his pocket, and grinned to himself because, for the first time since that flight, he realized something. The day went slowly at school, with each hour dragging like a heavy curtain between Elliot and the moment he could return home. The hallways were bustling with conversations, but wherever he went, the noise seemed to dim around him. Eyes followed him, not in mockery but in quiet curiosity. This wasn't the kind of attention that comes with fame, but rather the kind that follows someone who has been on the brink of something bigger than anyone wanted to talk about. Loud at lunch, he sat at his usual table in the far corner of the cafeteria with his friends Ben, Claire, and Theo. They joined him as usual, but their usual banter and joking were missing. Instead, they picked at their food while stealing glances at him, not sure if they should ask or pretend that everything was normal. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "It's all over the news, you know, and I assumed that they're showing the video, the part where she slapped you," Ben added, "and the part where your dad approached her like a boss that." Theo leaned in and asked, "Is it true that she got fired?" Elliot remained silent for a moment before saying, "She got removed from the flight, she's suspended, the rest is still being decided." His tone was calm, but there was a weight to it that hadn't been there before. He hadn't intended to become a symbol of anything, but now that the spotlight had found him, he couldn't avoid it. "You okay?" Claire asked softly, and Elliot nodded, but his eyes remained down. "I will be back at headquarters." As the legal team concluded their briefing, the senior leadership team of the airline sat in silence as Preston stood in a glass-walled meeting room with his arms folded and his expression unreadable. One executive said, "We've directed media outlets to our formal statement and made it clear that the incident is under review. Public reaction is heavily in your favor." "I'm not concerned about public reaction," Preston responded sharply, and the room fell silent once more. The HR director cleared her throat, "And we've drafted a policy overhaul that includes extended training, behavior audits, and crew mentorship. We're also creating a direct reporting line that bypasses mid-level management and sends discrimination complaints straight to the executive board. I'm worried that something like this could have happened under our name, and I'm worried that no one at the time, not even an employee or witness, stepped in before it became a headline." No one objected, and Cheryl sat at her small kitchen table wearing a plain gray sweater with her hair tied back loosely. She had stayed at home all day, with the curtains drawn, the television off, the phone flipped face down, and the only sound in her apartment being the steady ticking of a clock on the wall. "Approve it and name it after him," Preston said again, and everyone turned toward him. "Name it after my son," she said. "Let every crew member see it every time they open a training manual. Let them remember what it cost. You don't know me and I didn't know you, but I made a decision about who you were without asking, so I took your peace and turned it into pain. I can't take that moment back." The apology email was still in the drafts folder, and she hadn't added to it or deleted it. She just stared at it, unsure of whether she had the right to say anything at all. Eventually, she clicked send, but she didn't send it to Preston or Brenda. Instead, she sent it to Elliot. He sat at his desk finishing homework that evening as the sun dipped low and gold light poured through Elliot's bedroom window. His phone buzzed, so he picked it up and saw the email notification. He read the name for a moment, his stomach twisted, and he opened it. "For the first time, she stopped feeling stuck, but I can assure you that this is the last time I ever act from a place of pride. I'm sorry." She pressed send and sat back, unsure if it would even be read. It wasn't enough, but it was a beginning. 2 weeks later, the buzz of headlines subsided, but the story didn't fade. It had evolved into something else. Some things didn't need answers, some just needed to be heard, and Cheryl, sitting in her quiet apartment, finally heard herself for the first time. He read every word slowly twice, then closed the email, put the phone down, and looked out the window. He didn't reply, so he didn't erase it either. Elliot Carter policy reform was now prominently displayed at the top of every internal memo pertaining to conduct equality and passenger respect. Preston hadn't chosen the name for drama or branding, rather, he did it because he wanted every employee to be reminded of what silence had permitted and what accountability now required. This was evident in training sessions, policy binders, and whispered conversations among crew members on flights across the nation inside company buildings. Although there were no PowerPoint slides or prefabricated tests, Preston personally reviewed the program and insisted that it include real case studies, such as Elliot's story, which was discussed openly and uncomfortably in training rooms full of people who could no longer say, "I didn't know he watched the first session from behind a tinted observation window." The facilitator read the scenario aloud. It was practical crew members who were now required to complete updated training that focused on behavioral psychology, implicit bias, and emotional intelligence. He heard the flight attendants writhe in their seats, their faces rigid, some shifting in their chairs, and one of them speaking up said, "I would have stepped in." The facilitator nodded but responded evenly, "Why didn't anyone else have an answer?" Preston left before the session ended because he didn't need to hear them talk about it. What mattered was that they were being forced to face it, and in that discomfort something new could. Elliot returned to school and started to get used to his routine. The initial shock of what had happened had subsided, and he no longer walked through the hallways with everyone staring at him. Most of the students had stopped whispering when he passed, but the experience had altered his way of moving in the world. Instead of being afraid, he became more aware of things, such as when a convenience store security guard followed another child around without cause, or when a classmate's father made a sarcastic remark about some children acting too entitled. At lunch, a younger student, Marcus, a 7th grader, approached him nervously and said, "Hey, I saw what happened on the news, just wanted to say it was wrong." Elliot smiled small and kind, thanking him. "People used to tell me that I didn't look like I should be in the honors class, but I understood now." The words didn't hurt the same way anymore. They confirmed something he now knew was always there, just quieter, just hidden. But with that awareness came something else too. That night, Preston returned home early, not from the office, but from a board meeting where he had been offered an award, which he turned down because the organizers had called it a leadership and crisis award. Elliot didn't feel like a hero or a symbol, but rather like someone who had been thrown into a storm and learned to walk through the rain without ducking his head. "Forget you earned it," the boy said, grinning, and left. But Preston saw it as something else. "They want to congratulate me for fixing something I allowed to exist," he told Brenda as they sat in the den. "I'm not taking credit for cleaning up my own house." Brenda stirred her tea, her voice calm. "You didn't build the problem, Preston. I didn't break it," he said, "but I didn't see it soon enough either." She put a hand on his. Upstairs, Elliot was going through his email when he came across something new, an invitation from the school principal. He stared at it for a while before typing a simple reply, "Yes, I'll be there." He hit send and then leaned back in his chair for a moment, looking toward the window where the moonlight spilled onto the floor. He thought about everything that had happened, the pain, the silence, the slap, the cameras, the eyes that watched, and the words, "Elliot, we are organizing a student-led forum on equality representation and student voice. Your presence on the panel would bring real meaning to the conversation. We hope you'll consider it." It was a bright Saturday morning when Elliot and Preston found themselves sitting side by side in a small, sunny auditorium inside the local community center. Because he remained standing when it would have been easier to sit down and disappear, he closed his laptop. The world wasn't fixed, but it was finally listening. The voices that remained silent abruptly stopped looking past him, and the world began to see him clearly. This wasn't because he shouted or because he forced them. The room was packed with students, teachers, parents, and even a few school district leaders who had shown up not knowing what to expect but knowing they had to be there. Elliot had been quiet the entire way over. Preston hadn't put any pressure on him. He had just offered support, driving his son there, sitting in the front row, letting him lead when things got busy. The area was covered with corporate banners or press logos, just school posters, student art, and a small cloth sign above the stage that read, "Voices That Matter." When Elliot's name was called, he got up and walked to the stage, his hands steady but his heart pounding quickly. He wasn't used to microphones or being in front of a large crowd, but something inside of him changed. He wasn't here to perform, he was here to tell the truth. He sat on the panel between two other students, one of whom was a girl who had been harassed in class, and the other was a boy who had been unjustly disciplined for something he hadn't done. The moderator, a gentle teacher named Mr. Hadley, asked each participant to recount a time when they felt helpless. When it was Elliot's turn, he glanced at the microphone and then at the audience before taking a moment to gather himself. "I was seated in a chair that my father had purchased." He spoke clearly, and I showed my ticket and followed all the rules, but I was still pulled out and hit. The room went silent, and she didn't ask questions, didn't speak calmly, and didn't even try to determine whether I was at fault. She simply looked at me and concluded that I didn't belong. Letting the words sink in, I didn't yell, I didn't fight, I didn't say anything loud, but something happened that day. She made a decision about me based only on my appearance, and for a while, I thought maybe I shouldn't have been there. Some of the adults shifted in their seats, and Brenda, who was sitting a few rows behind Preston, wiped a silent tear from her cheek. But then something else happened. People noticed what she did, and they remained silent. After that, people began to listen, and I realized being. "And I'm not just talking about what happened to me," Elliot said, slowly raising his voice. "I'm talking about every kid in this room who's been told they're too loud or not polished enough or don't look like they belong. I'm talking about all the quiet stuff, the stuff that doesn't get filmed but happens every single day. Simply being seen isn't enough, you have to be respected." A round of gentle applause started to grow. When he sat back down, there was no standing ovation, but that made it more real because no one was applauding because he was Preston Carter's son. They applauded because his story didn't belong to him alone, it belonged to all of them. After the panel, a line silently formed near the stage, not for autographs but for conversations. He looked around the room, locking eyes with students in the crowd. "If we don't talk about it, it keeps happening. If we don't tell the truth, it just hides better. So I'm telling mine because silence isn't strength." She approached and said, "My teacher tells me I talk too much, but my brother talks just as much and she calls him confident." I was at a loss for words, so Elliot nodded and told her, "Don't change, let them catch up." Preston was standing nearby with a small group of district officials, one of whom was a woman from the equity office, who said carefully, "Your son, he's got presence." Preston grinned with pride in his eyes and said, "He's got clarity, the presence came after." When he got home that evening, Elliot put the Forum School badge on his desk. He didn't pin it to the wall or post about it online. Instead, he kept it there subtly as a reminder when Brenda entered with a cup of cocoa and placed it next to him. I heard what you said today, he said, looking up, surprised that he didn't see you. You made people feel seen. She smiled like your father and leaned back in his chair. Do you think she meant it, Brenda? I believe she meant it at that moment, but what she does next will determine whether it meant anything more. Elliot didn't respond, instead looking down at his desk. He wasn't angry anymore, and he wasn't trying to prove anything, but he would never forget the moment someone assessed his value based only on their own fear. Now, with each silent step he took, he was creating something greater than retaliation. He was creating a path so that the next child to occupy seat 1A wouldn't have to bear the burden of proving they belonged because they. For the Carter family, the season brought more than just a change in weather, it brought clarity. A month had already passed, and spring had already begun to spread across the city, with trees blooming along sidewalks, soft sunlight spilling onto front porches and rooftops, and the air no longer heavy with winter silence. As he stood on the balcony of his office tower, the skyline spread wide before him, the city pulsed below flashing signs, honking taxis, and lives unfolding, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His phone buzzed with messages, but he chose to ignore it instead. Scrolled to a picture on his screen, a straightforward image of Elliot standing at the student forum with a microphone in his hand and his head held high. He had viewed the image a dozen times since that day, not out of pride or to relive the moment, but because it reminded him that being a leader meant more than just running a business. It meant owning the air that people breathed when they entered a space you built and making sure that air was safe, clean, and accessible to everyone. A knock came softly from the door, and his assistant entered, announcing that the final report from Flight 227 was ready. He nodded, took the file, and opened it. At the top were the words "closed case" in bold, followed by a summary of disciplinary actions, policy changes, retraining programs, and the entire timeline of events. Everything had been handled legally and publicly, but one line at the end, added by someone in the Internal Affairs Department, stood out because one boy didn't yell back, "Thousands more will be treated right." Instead of smiling, Preston simply signed his name, closed the file, and left. Across town, Elliot sat in his room with his headphones off, the world outside his window soft with the orange glow of the evening. On his desk, he had something new. A letter in a plain white envelope with just his name on it, no logo, no return address, and no logo. He had received it 2 days prior, but he hadn't opened it until now. He unfolded the paper slowly. I've watched the videos and read the articles, but none of them adequately conveyed how composed and resilient you were. I want you to know that I'm not who I formerly thought I was. Cheryl Dawson. Elliot read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and putting it in the drawer next to his bed. He didn't feel satisfied or bitter, just quiet and something close to understanding. He then went downstairs, where Brenda was setting down dinner plates. It's fair that I followed the rules, but I only saw what I wanted to. I lost the job I worked for, but perhaps that's fair because you lost something that day too, your peace, your dignity, your trust. I hope you get everything back. When they sat down to eat, no one talked about the flight or the media. Instead, they talked about school projects, the game on Saturday, Brenda's new cookbook, and other normal things that had seemed so far away for a while. "Dad's home," he said. "Should be any minute now." Elliot walked to the window and watched the gate swing open as Preston's car rolled up the driveway. The door opened, and Preston stepped out, his jacket over one shoulder. Looked at Elliot and said softly, "They've added your name to the new crew handbook. It's part of the first section, what respect means on every flight." Elliot stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth, saying, "You didn't have to do that. I didn't." Preston said the board did remind them that rules aren't just words, your actions reminded them of the consequences of silence. Elliot looked down for a moment, and then he said, "I still think about the moment she slapped me." Preston didn't flinch. "You always will." Elliot nodded, but it didn't hurt the. Similar to how the sky outside no longer turned from gold to dark blue, Brenda gathered dishes while humming to herself, and Preston leaned back in his chair. Elliot then walked to the living room and opened his backpack to retrieve the forum badge. He didn't wear it or show it off, but he kept it close because it meant something now. The boy in seat 1A, who was told he didn't belong, had changed something by remaining motionless and allowing the world to observe him. refusing to go away, and as a result, people in uniform remembered their silence, and an airline changed the way it trained its employees because a boy remained in his seat and taught the world to see him. If this story resonated with you, please like it, leave a comment, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring tales like this one. Your support is greatly appreciated.